Welcome to Strip Cover Lit, where we squeeze the bigger picture out of literature. I am Adrian Fort, and we are here for part 2 of a 4-part series as we haunt along Henrik Ibsen's play Ghosts. This is Act 2. Next week will be Act 3, and then the following week will be a review of the play itself. So here in Act 2, what was it that happened? We open up as dinner is finished. Oswald leaves, presumably to get a smoke, and Regina is dismissed. This leaves Mrs. Alving and Manders to discuss things. And it turns out that the help with whom Mr. Alving had been having an affair is Regina's mother, making her Oswald's sister, half-sister, as well as not Engstrand's daughter. So she has no blood relation to Engstrand. In fact, Mr. Engstrand had taken Joanna as his wife, knowing full well that she was pregnant, and presumably she was carrying a parcel of money with her to make her attractive to another suitor. Well, shortly after this, old Engstrand shows. Some of these names are difficult for me. Alving is difficult for me. Manders is difficult for me, and Engstrand is difficult for me. So I apologize for this. But Engstrand shows up wearing his Sunday's best, and he has a favor to ask of Manders. He wants to go to the orphanage in order to say some prayers. Manders, being a man of God and very patient, seizes this opportunity to call Engstrand out for lying to him about the fact that Regina is not his daughter. Engstrand says that he was simply keeping his wife's honor because, in the eyes of God, isn't that what a man is to do? And he doesn't care that he's not Regina's father. He feels responsible for her all the same. Shortly thereafter, he asks if he can dedicate his life savings to create a sailor's home, someplace for the sailors to go, so that they do not fall into all of the debauchery that is available to them in their short stays on land. Manders agrees to think it over. After this, Engstrand leaves. Shortly thereafter, Manders leaves. Shortly thereafter, Oswald shows back up. He enters and he is distraught. He wants to speak with his mother and he wants to have a serious conversation with her. And it turns out that he feels his life is gone to bunk and he has an STD. STI? I'm not sure. The terminology has changed, from what I understand. And though I do not believe it is ever told to us what STD, STI, S to something it is, I believe we are left to assume it's syphilis. Syphilis would have at this time been a life sentence, a death sentence. It would have meant very bad things were coming very, very shortly. Also, he has promised. This is one that's going to hit you. This is the one. This tugs on the old heartstrings. Remember in that first act when Regina is speaking to Engstrand, her father, and she keeps slipping in French phrases, and you get this feeling that she feels superior because of them. Though she doesn't ever say it. She never calls her father out for being lesser than her. But she is very proud of the fact that she knows these French phrases. In his malaise, during this time, speaking to his mother, he talks about how he promised to take Regina to France. It is because of that that she had been learning French. Further, he plans to marry her. Mrs. Alving has had enough. She calls Regina in. She makes sure that even Regina has some champagne in her before this starts. She's going to tell everyone the truth. But Manders shows back up. And Engstrand, he says, will have his sailor's home. And Regina is to go there and assist him. Manders is here still trying to right those wrongs of the past, it seems, as well as get Regina out of that house. Regina, however, in this time declines. She does not want to go help Engstrand with his sailor's home. She doesn't know. She still is sort of under the impression that he is a not well-to-do father. Not that he has stood up for her when he didn't have to, and assumed the role of father, which he didn't have to do. Because this sum of money with which her mother came to him, he agreed that that money should all go to her raising, to benefit the child, not the parents. Another stand-up thing to do. Regina declines to help Engstrand with the sailor's home, as well as Oswald. Oswald declares in front of Manders then that he intends to marry Regina, and Manders is appalled. Mrs. Alving basically tells everyone to shut up. She needs to ready herself. She's about to come clean about everything, when all of a sudden there is a hullabaloo outside, and it turns out the orphanage is burning down. We are left to assume, probably because there was a previous conversation. There was the previous conversation about not insuring the place, after which we were all but too sure that it was going to burn down. But there was also that conversation talking about Engstrand and how he had a terrible habit of being careless with his matches. So we are left to assume that it is Engstrand who has burned the place down. As far as conversation about this Act 2, I'd like to start on page 27 with this exchange between Manders and Mrs. Alving. "What sum was it that the girl had?" asks Manders, and Mrs. Alving replies it was £70. Manders: "Just think of it, for a paltry £70 to let yourself be in marriage to a fallen woman." Miss Alving replies, "What about myself then? I let myself be bound in marriage to a fallen man." And Manders says, "Heaven forgive you, what are you saying, a fallen man?" Mrs. Alving says, "Do you suppose my husband was any purer when I went with him to the altar than Joanna was with Engstrand when he agreed to marry her?" And Manders says, "The two cases are as different as day from night." To which Mrs. Alving replies, "Not so very different at all. It is very true that there was a great difference in the price paid between a paltry £70 and a whole fortune." A couple things here. Number one, this is sort of an allusion to Matthew 16:26. What will it profit a man if he gains the whole world yet forfeits his soul? But also, it is setting up expectations for something to come later. It is setting up the expectation that Engstrand is every bit as wayward as we have been led to believe. And all it took was $70 for him to sell his soul and marry a fallen woman. On top of that, this is Manders, the man of God, suggesting that a fallen woman and a fallen man are different things. He is suggesting that all a woman brings with her is her presumed virginity, her presumed purity, versus someone such as Mr. Alving, who was able to acquire a great deal more wealth in his life than was Joanna, than would have been Mrs. Alving had she not married him. So there is a lot going on in that very small little exchange, but it's also bringing into question that idea of purity. And how can someone's impurity rub off on someone else? If it is Joanna who was impure, how is it that Engstrand inherits, again, with Henrik Ibsen, the idea of inheritance, inherits that impurity simply from trying to claim her as his own and claiming himself as her own? In that trading of the selves, because she is impure, does that mean that his inherited soul to her becomes impure in the process? There's a lot to talk about in the ideas towards sex in a Victorian type society, especially as we get towards the end of this act, where it turns out that Oswald has had improper relations with someone who had allowed him, who had forced him, who had given to him, presumably syphilis. And it raises another question. The doctor had said that probably you were born with it. Probably you were born with it means two things that have very large implications to this play. If probably you were born with it, it means for sure that Mrs. Alving would have syphilis. It means also that Joanna probably would have had syphilis, Joanna being Regina's mother. If that is the case, it answers the one big glaring question in all of this. Where is Joanna? The second question to all of this has to do with Mr. Alving. We know that he's passed. We know he's dead. We know he's gone. How did he die? So how did Mr. Alving and Joanna die? Was it with syphilis? I think that those are questions that have to at least be asked. And forgive me if it is someplace in this text and I passed right over it. But I've been wondering, I wondered where Mr. Alving was, because the references to him as a captain, maybe something happened at sea, maybe something happened at war, that's easy to write off. Joanna, her absence has been glaring since we get the implication that Engstrand is Regina's father. On 28, we are continuing this argument between Mrs. Alving and Manders, where Manders is learning of the impropriety of Mr. Alving, not just the once with the help, but throughout the marriage and before. And Manders, when the question is brought up, says, "If I had understood anything of the kind, I would not have been a daily guest in your husband's house." Is that the role of a man of God? Is it his job to stay away from those who are fallen? To avoid them like the plague, as it were, if we're talking about syphilis? Is that what he should have been doing? Or should he have been trying to reclaim Mr. Alving's soul with him in much the same way that Engstrand was there for Joanna? The implication is made that Engstrand had been hot on the trails of Joanna for a very long time, and it was not until she was fallen that she agreed to be there with him. So here we have Engstrand being the stand-up guy. But on 30 and 31, Mrs. Alving, in this same conversation, talks about being obsessed with the presence of ghosts that she cannot get rid of. Mr. Manders questions her, and she offers this explanation. Ghosts. When I heard Regina and Oswald in there, it was just like seeing ghosts before my eyes. I am half inclined to think we are all ghosts, Mr. Manders. It is not only what we have inherited from our fathers and mothers that exist again in us, but all sorts of old dead ideas and all kinds of old dead beliefs and things of that kind. They are not actually alive in us, but they are dormant all the same, and we can never be rid of them. Whenever I take up a newspaper and read it, I fancy I see ghosts creeping between the lines. There must be ghosts all over the world. They must be as countless as the grains of sands, it seems to me. And we are so miserably afraid of the light, all of us, to which Mr. Manders replies, there we have the outcome of your reading. Fine fruit it has borne. This abominable, subversive, free-thinking literature. And they have a bit of an exchange, to which Mrs. Alving later replies, by forcing me to submit to what you called my duty and my obligations by praising as right and just what my whole soul revolted against, as it would against something abominable. That was what led me to examine your teachings critically. I only wanted to unravel one point in them, but as soon as I had got that unraveled, the whole fabric came to pieces, and then I realized that it was only machine-made. And here in this one small exchange, we have summarized the 3 plays that we've read from Henrik Ibsen so far. You have the ideas of inheritance, you have ideas of sexuality, you have the ideas of social mores, and you have questioning Christianity. And you also have the downplaying of art. So this is just summarized basically everything that we've read so far from Henrik Ibsen. But it is interesting that Manders is very quick to assume that it is her reading of free-thinking literature that leads Mrs. Alving to these sinful ways of questioning God, to these sinful ways of assuming that there is more debauchery in the world than Manders is aware of, which leads in very short order to this quote on 32, Manders, having just learned about Engstrand knowing Joanna was pregnant Joanna was pregnant when they married, and still not only claiming Regina as his child, but lying to Manders about it. To think of that, he, of all men, could conceal the truth from me. Lowly Engstrand was able to lie to me, the man of God. Lowly Engstrand was able to slip it past me. What wonderful condescension there be. This is, to me, the sweetest payoff so far in the play. To me, the sweetest payoff so far in the 3 Henrik Ibsen plays that we've read. This idea that Manders believes not only that he is above contempt, not only that he is above being lied to, but also that he must be so intelligent it would be nearly impossible to lie to him, especially for someone so lowly as Engstrand. Which Engstrand then goes on, 34, to say, Manders says, how could you possibly justify what you did in lying to him? And Engstrand says, was the poor girl to go and increase her load of shame by talking about it? Just suppose, sir, for a moment, that your reverence was in the very same predicament as my poor Joanna. And Manders says, I? Engstrand says, good Lord, sir, I don't mean the same predicament. I mean, suppose there were something of your reverence that your reverence were ashamed of in the eyes of the world, so to speak. We men oughtn't to judge poor woman too hardly, Mr. Manders. And Manders says, but I am not doing that at all. What I am it is you I am blaming. So basically, what happens here is Manders, Engstrand defends himself by saying, I had my wife's best interests in mind. I did not want to increase her load of shame. And Manders says to Engstrand, bro, it's bros before hoes. Don't forget that. That's essentially what's going on there. There is no other reason for that truthfulness to be there except for the fact that, hey man, we're men. This is supposed to be between us. Let them have their lowly lies between each other, but we're supposed to be on the level. And later on the page, there is a brief mention from Engstrand that her confiding in him caused much gnashing of teeth, which is a biblical reference to hell, saying essentially that carrying this with him has sent him to hell, but he didn't care. He was there for his woman, and that's the only person that he had to be there for. And then on the kissing page, page 35, Engstrand's just taken the show in this act. He says, yes, I do make bold to say that I brought up the child and made my poor Joanna a loving and careful husband, as the Bible says we ought. But it never occurred to me to go to your reverence and claim credit for it or to boast about it, because I had done one good deed in this world. No, when Jacob Engstrand does a thing like that, he holds his tongue about it. Unfortunately, it doesn't often happen. I know that only too well. And whenever I do come to see your reverence, I never seem to have anything but trouble and wickedness to talk about. Because, as I said just now, and I say it again, conscience can be very hard on us sometimes. So, despite the fact that Engstrand is proving to be the most stand-up individual in this entire thing, because the argument might be presented at this point, well, Mrs. Alving has been a pretty stand-up individual. She is lying to nearly everyone. We have to remember that. Now, these lies might be for the good, much in the same way that Engstrand is for the good, but she's also forcing her stepdaughter and her son into very close confines, and has somehow been ignorant of the fact that they have something of an intimate relationship, which has resulted very clearly from the fact that they did not know that they were related. But Engstrand, and also, she's kind of boring. Mrs. Alving as a character is kind of boring. When she's not giving us revelations and saying that she's questioning her religion, she questioned the sanctity of marriage, when she's not doing any of that, she's just sort of boring. Engstrand seems a funny guy. Seems to have this really strange sense of stiff upper lip. And I think it's unfortunate that we're following Mrs. Alving most closely through this, because she seems to be the least interesting character. Imagine following Manders. He's sort of a bumbling fool. It might be fun to see him upended. Imagine that we were following Engstrand. He seems to get himself into enough trouble on his own. Him trying to seek that path of righteousness while also being a pretty stand-up fella would be fun to see. Mrs. Alving is just sort of bland and blah. But it is strange here, again, how between page 30 and 35, where we get that final quote from Engstrand here, every subject thematically that we've spoken about so far with Henrik Ibsen, through Peer Gynt, through A Doll's House, and now into Ghosts, every subject that we have breached thematically has been present, and has been present in full force being struggled with openly by these characters. So that is all that I have for this, the second in a 4-part series on Ghosts by Henrik Ibsen. But I hope to see you back here next week for Act 3, and after that, finally, for the review on Ghosts. It really helps me out if you hit that like button. If you did enjoy this, maybe share this with a ghost that you have in your life through some form of social media. And if you want to help me grow further on this channel, there is, as always, a link to the Patreon to be found in the description below.